Good evening. Good evening to everyone, and welcome to St. John's. For those of you I don't know, my name's Sue Black and I'm the president of St. John's. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Founders Lecture. The lecture was created in 2005 as part of the 450th anniversary celebrations of the founding of St. John's College in 1555 by Sir Thomas White. Although a celebration, the purpose of the lecture is also to explore and discuss the principles and ideas that underlie any aspect of higher education. So tonight, it is incredibly apt and both an honour and a delight to welcome Catherine Mallyon to give this year's Founders Lecture. Catherine won't thank me for letting you know that she matriculated in 1981, reading history. And she was a member of the Big Wheel, a travelling theatre company to which a number of English students belonged. She spent 5 years working in the City of London as a trader and an analyst following graduation, and then trained in general arts with the Arts Council in England. Between 1993 and 1999, she was back in Oxford as general manager at the Oxford Playhouse. And by 2005, she became deputy chief executive of the South Bank Centre. I could keep listing her successes, but we actually really want to get on and hear from Catherine. And so I'm going to leapfrog to two of her most recent achievements. Catherine was the executive director of the Royal Shakespeare Company until December of 2023, and she's now chair of the Birmingham Hippodrome Theatre Trust. We're delighted and honoured that Catherine is an Honorary Fellow of St. John's, and she was awarded a CBE in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Birthday Honours List in July of 2022 for her services to theatre and the arts. As an undergraduate student, she made it clear that if our history tutors did not admit a satisfactory number of women at admission, they would have her to answer to. A formidable woman who is definitely on a mission. And this evening, Catherine is going to talk to us about current issues in cultural leadership, reflecting on them through the lens of her own leadership experiences from different institutions that she has led. In particular, she will highlight the constantly changing tensions that require thoughtful navigation in order to provide the maximum opportunities for people to experience the arts and culture learning. Catherine, it is our pleasure and it is our honour to ask you to give this year's Founders Lecture. Catherine Mallyon, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. How lovely to be here and to see so many old friends. What a pleasant surprise. I'm proud and surprised, to be honest, to be an Honorary Fellow of this college, and was entirely amazed to be asked to give this lecture. But thank you very much for the invitation. Though there were moments when I was preparing that I thought a polite decline might have been the most appropriate response. However, it has turned out to be fun to have the opportunity to reflect on cultural leadership, or, as it has turned out, with thoughts on executive leadership within the performing arts, specifically theatre. I started 2024 with two interesting leadership shifts. I moved from 11 years as executive director at the Royal Shakespeare Company to becoming chair of the Birmingham Hippodrome, and through a maternity cover of the chief operating officer role to working with the executive director at the Old Vic in London. So this is definitely a moment for reflection on leadership, and perhaps in particular, how best to exemplify good leadership in different circumstances. I may have overreached myself with the wide-ranging title of this talk, although I'm sure much of what I will talk about will apply widely over the cultural sector and will overlap into leadership in completely different areas. But there is so much I won't touch upon. Just as one example, I'm, to be honest, relieved that I have never had to grapple with the profound challenges of collection ownership of museums. In turn, though, museum directors might not miss, again as an example, the heat around casting choices. We share many things, though, not least that in this business, brilliance for one can be deeply uninspiring for another. For me, the role of a cultural leader is clear. We must be in service to the aims of the cultural organisation, an organisation that is often also a charity. Or to put it very simply, to the art and to the audience. I work in the arts to make a difference so that audience members and participants can have the very best experience of art and artistic activity. Wherever that is taking place, on theatre stages, inside or outside in found spaces, in learning contexts, online or virtually. When I was introduced to the RSC as the executive leader, I described my role in a very straightforward way. I had just 3 things to do: to provide the best environment and conditions for art and artists to flourish, to make sure all the touch points with audiences are as good as possible, and to enable the organisation to use its resources, people and financial, to work as smoothly as it can in order to make everything possible. So I still think that at its essence, cultural leadership is about these 3 things: the art and the artists, the audience and participants, and about the organisations, the companies that connect those 2. However, I'm not alone in observing that the context in which cultural leaders operate is more complex and challenging than ever, working in an environment where nuance is finding it increasingly hard to find the space it needs, and where values and opinions are strong. I will talk about some key themes. It's far from a handbook and not a complete list, but what I hope will be a flavour of what feels important to executive leadership now. These themes are what feel important to me. Others will have very different views, both on what matters and on how to do it. I know that at a personal level, someone wrote to me last year extremely generously to say that I have demonstrated how a 21st cultural organisation should be run. At the same time, over the past years, letter writers to the Stratford Herald and to the RSC directly have explicitly called for my head. I'm conscious that everything moves so fast that it may be but a blink before something causes a change in this list. And that speed of change is in itself one of the realities of now. But for the moment at least, there is strength in these themes. They all have inherent tensions, differing realities, and they all intersect and overlap. The task is to decide how to choose the weight to place on each, within each, or to find a balance of some sort, and therefore a creative way through. So I've picked 5 of these overarching themes to talk about today: advocacy, education, inclusion, resources, financial and environmental, and about sustainable ways of working, all about people. One of the risks of this lecture is that it could seem a long way from art and audiences. As one attempt to counter this, I'm using some productions and activities as illustrations, as you've seen already. I share the images by kind permission of the RSC. Hopefully, they will be a visual reminder of why all this matters. Leaping ahead. One of the tasks of cultural leaders is to enable as many different people as possible to have the choice to engage with excellent art. And in that enabling, they need to advocate for why that simple statement matters. I think there's something very important in providing hope for the future and supporting the development of skills for that future. And our actions must reinforce this advocacy by operating inclusively, equitably, and without discrimination. In many ways, it amazes me that the need for advocacy of the arts never seems to end. It seems entirely self-evident that both arts and cultural learning are at the heart of our lives. My response to why has always been a clear: because the arts enrich us. If you want facts and figures, visit the Campaign for the Arts, full of evidence at a personal, community, societal and economic level. I was reading about the composer Thomas Adès recently and loved his view that the greatest gift of art is to free us from time and space. I'll repeat that, it's good. The greatest gift of art is to free us from time and space. Cultural leadership now requires us all to be never tired of expressing that, to keep the arguments fresh, and to making sure that the supporting evidence is contemporary and relevant. A key part of that case for support is around the impact of cultural learning, of a cultural education, in studying the humanities. This is especially so now, with such increased pressure on arts and humanities. Even knowing this, I was startled when Sue, the president, told me that even here, applications and interest in humanities subjects is in decline. I shouldn't have been surprised. The national picture about reduced take-up of arts subject is so stark, as is an increasing lack of confidence in studying those subjects. This is completely wrong and completely short-sighted. To demonstrate why, I'll dive into a case study for a few minutes now. At the RSC, I spent much time supporting our education work and in enabling the RSC to become an independent research organisation, an IRO, the first performing arts organisation to have this status, awarded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Aside from the welcome validation, this status also provides the opportunity to undertake more research for the RSC and for the sector, and to seek research funding directly. The RSC has long had research as an integral part of its work, starting with the bedrock of staged productions themselves, requiring research and in many ways also being an act of research. Beyond that is the rich archive, developing immersive digital technologies, teacher action research, longitudinal studies into the benefits of expressive art subjects, and to the experiences of young people in schools. Working with children, young people, teachers, performing arts specialists and academics, including, I'm delighted to say, with the expertise of former St John's president, Professor Maggie Snowling. This year, the RSC has published Time to Act. This major research study explores the difference that Shakespeare's work and RSC teaching approaches make to the language development and social and emotional development of children and young people. Firstly, children's literacy, particularly their writing, improves. They write more. They use more complex language. They want to write, particularly children who have previously been reluctant to do so. And secondly, children's academic self-confidence improves. As the RSC team describe, when a child feels confident about Shakespeare's work, they feel differently about their ability to navigate other difficult things, and they think they are good at learning. They value their own independent thinking. The report contains detailed research findings arising from the use of existing validated social research tools to develop a writing measure that was then used in a randomised control trial. The outcomes were clear. Children in intervention schools outperformed control students in their ability to express emotion through their writing. They had greater resilience and optimism in that writing, and greater ability in comprehension and inferencing. This report followed a previous study, Time to Listen. In that research, young people reported that arts and culture-rich schools enhance their lives now and prepare them for life after school by developing their critical thinking and capacity to interpret the world around them, and by giving them a sense of their own identity and personal responsibility in their school and community. They said that they had built self-belief, confidence, empathy, and appreciation of difference and diversity, and that they had been able to express their ideas, opinions, and stories in a complex and nuanced way. Time to Listen was also materially influential in terms of the Russell Group changing their facilitating subjects list. Young people had said that the message they were hearing was that art subjects are of less value to them than other subjects. This change is important, but maybe the effect is still sadly lingering. We know, and research shows us, that we need the world to have the benefits of critical thinking, greater grasp indeed of nuance, and greater appreciation of difference. Theatre can give us the opportunity to think, to have ideas, and to change how we consider ourselves and others. We often in theatre talk about the fact that talent is everywhere and opportunity is not. The irony and attention to navigate is that theatre's actions do not always match its words. In All Change Please, a book focusing on gender in theatre, but widely relevant to all sorts of discrimination and lost opportunities, Lucy Kerbel brings together the three elements I spoke about at the start. If we can work out how to take advantage of the full pool of talent available to us, rather than just parts of it, we will create a broader, richer palette of work for our audiences, and we will run our organisations and structures in a more effective and successful way. I think that cultural leaders need to acknowledge and act on the implications of this. If we see theatre as a mirror to society, then those of us who make it, programme it, teach it and promote it have a responsibility to do that accurately, not to cut large chunks of the population out of the picture. There are undoubtedly structures, processes, habits and ways of working within theatre that do exclude. Whilst they may have their root causes elsewhere and are compounded by wider societal issues, cultural leaders must find a way of connecting and truly engaging so that we reflect the composition of our society, not replicate the behaviour of parts of that society. The world has changed so much in recent years. In 2014, John Chaucer wrote Pain in the Arts, an excellent book covering so much about the arts and leadership within the arts. It seems extraordinary now, however, that the index does not contain the words access, diversity, environment, inclusion, or sustainability. Although some of this will reflect changing language, I think it is reflective of the general point. Unsurprisingly, so much change leads to shifting sands, a challenge in building foundations, and a new level of difference to navigate. To take one current example, the debate over how much to share in advance about the content of theatre productions, also known as trigger warnings. For me, this is straightforward and relatively easily resolved, but that view is absolutely not the same for everyone. The way in which the debate can play out can end up being unhelpful and exclusionary. For some leading figures in the industry, they are hateful, undermining the power of theatre. For other similarly serious leaders, they are an access requirement and are far from being spoilers. How do we balance two profoundly serious views, and each one shared by other equally serious artists and leaders, in a way that matches our values and commitments? My view, and maybe the shared one if the reporting of this debate had not followed today's trend for clickbait and binaries, is that we need to enable audiences to take informed decisions about attending and about being excited to be in our theatres. Some audience members will be in an emotional, physical or financial position to take whatever comes. Others may not. And just as for years we have warned about strobes and gunshots, for example, we now know that there are more things we need to share in advance. That sharing, however, can be done in an entirely optional way, as a request when inquiring about booking or behind a click on a website. This is but one example of the different realities that are a day-to-day part of cultural leadership today. Complexities and constantly changing tensions laid bare by the traumatic disruption of COVID, but also moved forward by that disruption. A complexity often reported through the harsh lenses of culture wars or wokeness. Neither, of course, helpful phrases in moving towards a more equitable and engaged society. Finding a way through this territory is a key part of cultural leadership within companies, with the new expectations of colleagues and creative teams, and externally in terms of advocacy and positioning. As Hilary Carty, the Executive Director of Claw Leadership, said in 2022, reflecting on COVID, "There's no point going through the absolute horror of the last 2 years if we're not going to learn from it. We need to think, what can we do differently? How can we make things more equal for those for whom it wasn't equal? How can we make inclusivity part of the way we are, as opposed to some aspiration on a policy paper somewhere? How can we really be as embedded in our communities and what they want as we were during the pandemic?" Running our theatre companies with this in mind is a key part of my view of that cultural leadership. I should point out, however, that it's far from the only view. It seems to me that access and excellence are mutually reinforcing, not at odds with each other. For others, though, there is a real fear that an over-focus on access and inclusion is weakening the creative process and does not sufficiently value artistic excellence. And an example of this is the current debate around Arts Council England. Arts Council England, the National Development Agency for Creativity and Culture, published a new strategy in 2020. This was called Let's Create, and was a successor to the Great Art and Culture for Everyone of the previous 10 years. Before anything else, I must declare an interest, as I was a member of the Arts Council's National Council between 2018 and 21, during the period this strategy was finalised. In some quarters, there has been concern ever since 2020 that the new strategy itself did not value excellence, and that the first funding distribution informed by this strategy from 2023 demonstrated this. There was much coverage of the significant cuts to major cultural organisations, to the loss of funding for others, and of the fact that standstill funding for many organisations represents a significant real terms cut. There was, and continues to be, far less coverage of the new 272 organisations of 985 who joined the funded portfolio, probably reflecting the mainstream narrative and the long-standing strength, or perhaps power structures, behind that narrative. The arts leader Amanda Parker commented at the time that there is much to celebrate in the announcement, with diverse-led stalwarts such as Tallowa Theatre and Grey Eye receiving uplifts, and newcomers to the portfolio such as Chineke Orchestra getting visible recognition for the long-standing work they've put in. At the same time, though, Amanda writes, the true picture demands further analysis. Of the organisations funded, just 3% are headed up by people with disabilities. Improvements to ethnically diverse leadership are more significant. Although 15% of NPOs are now ethnically diverse-led, what's worth further interrogation is the share of the pot. Just 10% of funds distributed will be managed by leaders with lived experience of marginalisation. So they'll still be managing the narrative of need that's all too familiar to them. Amanda concludes that in the midst of this economic challenge, Arts Council has put the transformative power of culture at the heart of its offer, but has not quite balanced the books around equitable distribution. I understand that it's hard to do that in the face of significant overall reductions in government funding, but I believe it important that the direction of travel continues to be walked towards that equity, however much it threatens the status quo. There's another whole lecture on the COVID experience and what it taught us. For now, though, the key things for me are about being able to respond to change in remaining true to values, however much they are under pressure, and managing resources that suddenly look very different. In some cases, business and funding models are completely changed and not necessarily for the better. Out of the undeniably good news of the Cultural Recovery Fund, the unprecedented fund that supported cultural organisations through the pandemic, is the reality that many larger arts organisations have significant debt on their balance sheet for the first time. We may forget now, but there were times during 2020 when we did not know what the future was going to bring. At the RSC, we found a way to reduce payroll costs by 30%, but headcount by a far lower percentage. This was achieved because every department where it was possible to save costs by changed terms and conditions chose to do so. We took time to work together as a company to find the best solutions. I don't want to over-egg this, as it was extraordinarily difficult, and I think that the impact is still being felt at a personal level. But at the same time, it did feel as collaborative as it could have been. One of the ironies of the COVID period was that those companies who had the highest percentage of Arts Council funding found themselves in the least worst position, as that funding continued regardless of activity levels. Those with entirely self-generated income lost most of that, often losing all by the continuation of exceptionally generous philanthropy. I've worked within a number of different funding models. For example, the RSC, South Bank Centre and Oxford Playhouse with their core funding from the Arts Council, a Reading Arts and Venues running the Hexagon Concert Hall and South Street Arts Centre within Reading Borough Council, and currently at the Old Vic in London and the Hippodrome in Birmingham, both independent charities with no core Arts Council or local authority funding. One of the key leadership skills is always around maximising income, finding and developing new income streams, and in marshalling that financial resource in the best way. There have always been times of acute funding pressures, and this is indeed another one. Only a month ago, the journalist Lynn Gardner wrote that, quote, British theatre is running on empty, with cuts to funding at national and local authority level and a cost of living crisis severely impacting its ability to produce and support the freelancers who make theatre happen. The situation in Birmingham, where the City Council is making 100% cuts to the arts and culture budget, is a painfully close-to-home example of this crisis. The Birmingham crisis has wide-ranging impact beyond the arts, and the challenge for cultural leadership in that environment is interesting. Late last month, I co-chaired a meeting of the chairs of Birmingham cultural organisations. We were thinking about how to continue to respond to that situation, all from very different perspectives. Some organisations having lost materially significant levels of funding, others not directly, but with everyone recognising that there must be a creative way forward if we and the council can work together. Birmingham's community of civically minded arts organisations will continue to spend considerable time, resource and expertise on the arts and on projects of true social impact. Is there therefore an opportunity for a new type of partnership, one that can position this work in support of the city's emerging recovery strategy and for the good of the city, and to do so at the same time as making the case for reinstating and increasing local authority funding? Finding new sources of funding can easily become a slightly optimistic leadership mantra, and probably the better one is around increasing existing multiple income streams, but there can always be something new. Nesta, now described as the UK's Innovation Agency for Social Good, has created Arts and Culture Finance, which is designed to pilot a new approach to funding arts education. Time to Act, the report I spoke about earlier, was part funded by this scheme alongside the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. Arts and Culture Finance has a model based around social impact measures, an approach not widely used in the arts sector. It works by investors committing to payments if pre-agreed impact targets are met, and thus providing, hopefully, affordable, repayable finance. Nesta also worked alongside the RSC in 2016 as part of another research project. It's worth a few moments on that now, as it takes us into the realms of change through innovation, and then back to how it is, of course, all about people. Back in 2016, the RSC produced a wonderful production of The Tempest, directed by RSC Artistic Director Greg Doran, the current Cameron Mackintosh Visiting Professor of Contemporary Theatre, and here today. The production was characterised by Greg's ever-brilliant Shakespearean direction, wonderful acting, uplifting music, great design, and the first time using real-time immersive technology live on stage at this scale. It played to great success in Stratford and London, achieving its primary aim of entertaining audiences. It was produced in collaboration with Intel and the Imaginarium Studios. And as an aside, the in-kind support had an eye-watering financial value and is another example of multiple sources of funding. We also took the opportunity to reflect on what we had learnt from the production and worked with researcher Dr. Kerry Gorton to help us with that. As I wrote at the time, at the Royal Shakespeare Company, we create theatre at its best, wonderful productions enjoyed by audience, critics and everyone involved. They are in our memories as an enriching part of our lives. Then we move on to the next one. When a production creates something for the first time, overcomes enormous challenge, leads to new ways of working and is truly special, we want to take that opportunity to analyse what made this possible, to learn and to be confident that we can be as ambitious in the future. We wanted to seize this moment for The Tempest. We knew that using live performance capture and facial tracking technology for the first time on stage would require collaborative working of the highest order. The combination of inspired and inspiring people working with new technologies, often talking what felt like different languages inside our theatrical structure, was clearly going to be transformative. We knew that there was much to learn, and we were conscious that we were likely to be too close to see for ourselves patterns in our behaviour and approaches. Undertaking this research, published as Space to Play, enabled us to understand how we created the shared confidence to move through the project and reinforced our learning. The process identified 3 key principles for enabling innovation in this context. People first, recognise and celebrate expertise, motivate and support people to build skills and connect. Secondly, culture shift, enable risk, delegate and empower across hierarchies, provide time and space to play, and measure innovation beyond financial outputs. And finally, transformational leadership, provide motivation and mandate, develop traits and behaviours, invest in capacity and planning. The attitudes and behaviours shared by the multidisciplinary team who are identified as having a high level of trust, a pride in newness, generosity, forgiveness of chaos, though you may not be surprised to find I find that one hard, and resoluteness to deliver, one I find easier. Perhaps it's not surprising that despite all that technology, these key factors are so people-focused on how we need to do things, about values, about behaviours. I mentioned the words environment and sustainability earlier, and in many ways I should have reached them before now. Cultural leadership requires an ability to manage complexity and uncertainty, often emerging from the way in which the themes I am talking about come together, even clash. We need to be open to change, to be able to deliver change, and to recognise that whatever change is required must be as sustainable as we can possibly manage. So for me, there are sustainable ways of working that should colour how leaders work and encourage others to work, always having equity as a guiding star, and applying to the seeking and use of all resources, financial, natural, and people. We are living in a climate crisis, and we must respond to that in the way in which we approach everything we do. The Theatre Green Book came out of the pandemic, with the first part launched in 2021. It is clear that if theatre is to be part of the most vital conversation humanity faces, then it has to change its practice. We have to follow a path to a sustainable future. We have to look at how we make production sustainably, improve the sustainability of our buildings, and reduce the environmental impact of everything we do, inside and out. It's not lost on me that the tempest I've just spoken about was so resource heavy. Indeed, we were in awe of the amount of computing power. Whilst I don't think we were oblivious to the implications of this, I don't recall that in 2016 we voted that much time to really thinking about it. In 2023, however, we produced another tempest, directed by Elizabeth Freeston and groundbreaking in quite a different way, showing how much thinking around sustainability had changed in that time. The production was inspired, if that's the right word, by the climate emergency, and asked us to think about the delicate balances in our relationships, as well as with the fragile ecosystems that surround us. Everything around that production was considered through the lens of sustainability, explicitly supported by the Green Book, from local group Rubbish Friends sourcing materials, to the approach to design and lighting. The lighting designer Joanna Town described the excitement of working on a production that questioned everything. As she said, from how we design our shows to how we interact with the actual work we do, basically how we live our lives. Tom Piper, the designer, felt the same. He wrote, "We will have to change our mindset that budget is not the only challenge to creativity and that the ethical sourcing of our raw materials is now integral to the process. Budget constraints have always worked to spark creativity and imaginative solutions. The Green Book will do the same." The momentum is there for change, and leaders should harness that confidently. A survey last year by audience specialist Indigo found that 77% of audiences think that cultural organisations have a responsibility to influence society to make radical change in response to the climate emergency. So that's clear. But the challenge is often in the practicalities. Finding storage space. We don't want to see the same things on stage every time. What do we do when dramatically something needs to look brand new and opulent? What do we do about touring, especially internationally? And what do we do when reducing our impact on the environment, increasing our sustainability, has a higher short-term price tag than not changing our practice? And if those weren't sufficient competing realities, we then venture into the territory of philanthropic support and corporate sponsorship. How do we square the need to maximise multiple funding sources with the need to take the right choices about commercial partners and supporters? And BP is a good case study through which to consider this. In recent times, BP has been one of the touchstones for this debate, a valued supporter of the RSC for many years, but in the end, one that for us became unsupportable. As an example of the relative speed of change, in 2014, we reported pleasure at the renewal of the sponsorship from BP. In 2016, in my report to the board that BP wished to extend for another 5 years, I wrote, "This is not entirely straightforward news." In 2017, protests were prevalent, and in 2019, we reached the end of the sponsorship. BP's support was tied to the £5 ticket scheme for 16 to 25-year-olds, a scheme and support that was at the heart of RSC commitments to access. At the same time, the linking of BP and that scheme was problematic to many of those who used the scheme, our charitable beneficiaries. This was definitely a case of hard-edged realities colliding. Over 80,000 young people had benefited from that scheme. In our statement about ending the BP sponsorship, we reflected that central to our organisational values is that we listen to and respond to the views of young people. And we had, as I talked about earlier, just published Time to Listen. Each year, we were actively engaging 500,000 children and young people with Shakespeare's plays, and we had launched our first Youth Advisory Board earlier that year. We stated that amidst the climate emergency, which we recognise, young people are now saying clearly to us that the BP sponsorship is putting a barrier between them and their wish to engage with the RSC. We cannot ignore that message. We ended our statement with what, looking back, is rather an understatement. There are many fine balances and complex issues involved, and the decision has not been taken lightly or swiftly. From a personal perspective, that was entirely the case. There is a danger in a talk like this that it all sounds as though everything was clear and sorted. I didn't find any of it at all clear. Rather, it was full of painful and internal contradictions. As Erica Wyman, acting and deputy artistic director of the RSC, reflected in conversation with me, some of the lot of a cultural leader is having to live with choices that are necessarily imperfect. Indeed, sponsorship still remains controversial territory. Whilst landing well with the groups for which we took the decision, for others, we had gone too far. It was read that we didn't value donations sufficiently highly. And why on earth would we not accept sponsorship from a properly constituted UK company? Over subsequent years, BP's funding for arts organisations reduced significantly. The pressure group Culture Unstained reported in June 23 that there was a near total rejection of fossil fuel sponsorship by the UK cultural sector, echoed by The Guardian, who described the ending of the 27-year BP sponsorship of the British Museum as bringing to a close one of the highest profile and controversial of such deals in recent years, and marking the almost complete retreat of the fossil fuel giant from the British arts world. In December of the same year, 6 months later, the British Museum announced that a new multi-year partnership with BP will support the future transformation of the museum by contributing £50 million over 10 years. The partnership will also help deliver on plans to maintain public access for generations to come. We're delighted to have this support. Arguably, a perfectly coherent and rational view. Indeed, would £50 million have changed our minds back in 2019 at the RSC? I think the reality is that it might well have done, perhaps sadly, depending on your point of view. The logic for the decision we reached around a far, far smaller amount for a specific purpose would still apply. For example, if taking the sponsorship would have continued to alienate potential beneficiaries. But we were talking then about 3-year sponsorship terms. £50 million as an endowment, for example, could keep the scheme going pretty much in perpetuity. And clearly, £50 million by any terms is an extraordinarily significant sum of money. There is a very clear framework for charities overseen by the Charity Commission, and decisions such as these have to be taken in this context. Sometimes commentary forgets this, but it is at the heart of the realities of the situation. The starting point is that charities have to accept and keep a donation offered or given to a charity. There are then a series of factors to, quote, consider and balance. There are many, including the value of the donation and its potential to help further the charity's purpose, and the risk of reduced support for the charity or harm to its reputation, particularly amongst its supporters or beneficiaries, but also with other funders, stakeholders, employees and volunteers. The relatively recent new chair of the Charity Commission has perhaps upped the ante on this when he said in a speech at the end of last year that the Charity Commission would intervene, albeit rarely, when trustees decide to accept, refuse or return a donation if, quote, we consider that such intervention would be consistent with our risk and regulatory framework, including if decision-making is materially irrational. With the definition of this material irrationality being when it is apparent that the motivations for return or refusal as simply the personal worldviews or preference of the relevant trustees, rather than the best interests of the charity. Balancing all this is the stuff of cultural leadership today. Other examples are around international activity, with many current sources of tension around the appropriate cultural response. One of those is around work with and in the Middle East, for example, Saudi Arabia. Whilst a starting point for taking decisions is the UK government's diplomatic and trade position with any given country, at an individual level, profound concerns about fossil fuel, gender and sexuality quickly come into play. When the RSC toured to China 8 years ago, it was with a range of support reflecting the priorities at that time, specific funding from the UK government, the quote, deep commitment and active engagement of the Chinese Cultural Embassy, sponsorship from JP Morgan, significant international individual philanthropy, and trust and foundation support. This was all part of the golden era of UK-China relations, and I was part with other cultural leaders of a George Osborne-led delegation to China, all very explicitly the utilisation of soft power, a phrase I dislike. It's not soft and it's not power. Cultural connection and potential influence feels far better to me. The RSC's work in China grew from Greg's profound belief, quote, that we foster deeper understanding between cultures by sharing and telling each other our stories. As Greg said, China's rich dramatic heritage mirrors the epic scale, complexity and universality of Shakespeare's work and has a national curriculum which requires young people to study his plays. At the RSC, we were already exploring these relationships when the timing aligned with UK government priorities, such that we were funded for the major King and Country tour, for the Shakespeare Folio project, new Chinese translations of Shakespeare, and for the Chinese Classics project, for translating Chinese classics into English, including a contemporary adaptation by Francis Cowhig of Guan Hanjing's Snow in Midsummer, directed by Justin Audibert. This was a rich period of genuine cultural collaboration, producing some exceptional theatre. It was not always straightforward, however, as some colleagues at the RSC did not wish to participate, the combination of the Chinese and the corporate sponsorship proving too personally compromising. Feelings about other countries are as strong now, but how will individuals and organisations navigate what for some are real ethical challenges? How can leaders maintain a 360-degree integrity whilst acting in a 360-degree way for their organisations? I said I would come back to values and ways of working, and now is the moment. I think that the way through this and through the many other tensions will be found in the ways in which we work, the ways in which we support our people, and the frameworks within which we choose to operate. Within the arts, just as in other areas, there are different leadership styles, often reflecting needs at any one time. I don't, therefore, presume to be prescriptive. I will, though, share my reflections on what in the right circumstances work best as leadership within a cultural organisation. I'm sure that there is overlap between this and leadership in other sectors. Indeed, I guess the best way to think about where there might be a difference is around the presence and interaction of so many elements within cultural work. For example, the creative process and everyone involved in it, the audiences, the participants, people eating and drinking in the cafe and buying in the shop, the philanthropic support, the corporate sponsorship, the importance of physical theatres to the place within which they exist, and as a result of all that, the sheer number of stakeholders, people who care and have a view on how things should be. This is why, for me, an approach based in collaboration and the building of consensus is an important one, not to the exclusion of a speedy, quick decision whenever that is needed, but as the strong and consistent foundations enabling whatever nature of decision-taking is required. Over recent years, I've had thoughtful conversations with Professor Alex Hill, and it's been interesting to reflect on what he took from those with me talking about the RSC, and with others, for example, the All Blacks, NASA, and the Royal College of Art. His book, Centennials, 12 Habits of Great Enduring Organisations, was published last year. His research tallies with my experience, shaping these 12 habits into two groups: a stable core, comprised of purpose, stewardship, openness, and a disruptive edge with experts, nervousness, and accidents. Alex quotes me in the book as saying, taking on the role at the RSC was like being handed a precious vase and asked to walk across an ice rink. My job is to carefully carry it, keep it safe, and gently pass it on to the next person. And that's a feeling you'll never forget. I don't recall that at all, but it makes sense to me that I did say it. Alex uses the term radically traditional to describe the feeling of balance between a stable core and a disruptive edge, and says that out of this balance emerges the energy that propels forward and a stability that ensures no one loses sight of what they are there to achieve or forgets what has led to success in the past. Disruptive experts are essential for innovation and change. For example, the first Tempest I spoke about. Stable stewards preserve what is best about the organisation's culture and stop it lurching off track. I'm sure there are some astounding people who can do both. Alex believes that if a problem or crisis arises, it's vitally important that you look to your stable core first and then to your disruptive edge, not the other way round. Creating this stability and looking then to enabling a disruptive edge is core to my approach. But new ideas and fresh perspectives are always needed, maybe even more so in times of crisis. It seems important that things are not static. Change is indeed essential. I spent some time as chair of the advisory group for the Centre for Cultural Value based at Leeds University, and some of their research has led to a call for a change to more regenerative working within the sector. With resonance of Hilary Carty's words, their research showed that experience of COVID meant that we could no longer deny or refuse to acknowledge the stark inequalities in our sectors, the unsustainable working hours and patterns, the damaging bullying and harassment, the poor pay levels, and the often shocking disregard for freelancers and independent artists. In addition to the obvious need for time to reflect and to recuperate, Ben Walmsley, the director of the centre, describes regenerative working as taking the often difficult decision to do less and doing it in smarter, more sustainable ways. Co-producing and co-creating so that power, skills and ownership are more equitable and distributed across organisations and networks. It involves moving closer to our communities and finding ways to carry out effective and ethical place-based work. It requires an ethos of care and mutual support that respects artists and audiences as core partners and co-producers of cultural value. It means thinking of ourselves as an interconnected community rather than a competing set of organisations, an ecology rather than an industry. It means less focus on transactional relationships and more on relational engagements. Or back to Lucy Kerbel, a lot of the work we all need to do is about slowing down our decision-making processes, or at least building in more time, or including more people in the process of reaching a decision before a choice is made. This can be incredibly hard. Often the sector's culture pushes against this. But as a sector, we do have ways of doing this, practices that work in this way. Often, for example, through creative placemaking programs. Creative placemaking is about taking a people-centered approach, bringing artists and communities together to remake or reimagine spaces through creative opportunity. For me, it also emphasises the importance of cultural organisations to the places they inhabit, and perhaps even more so, of the importance of place to those organisations. For the RSC, this was about building relationships with Stratford-upon-Avon, with a mission to shape inspirational change with people and to learning from a different best practice in ways of working with different areas of expertise and at different scales. Just one example at the Forest's Edge from last year. This was a celebration of nature and communities in Stratford-upon-Avon, created by artists in partnership with 6 local groups, and drawing inspiration from the stage productions Hamnet, based on Maggie O'Farrell's novel, and Shakespeare's As You Like It. Their co-created trail of willow sculptures truly celebrated nature, human relationships and their stories, and it was created over time, and indeed over space, whilst freeing us from our own time and space. So we circle back close to where we started, theatre as a mirror to and an intrinsic part of society, and also, in the words of theatre director and former RSC leadership associate Justin Tayman, with the imperative to model a better world. Cultural leaders need to have the integrity to do that modelling and to negotiate the tensions and challenges that exist as a result of those inescapable facts. My final production example is of the RSC's A Midsummer Night's Dream, subtitled A Play for the Nation, directed by Erica Wyman in 2016, the 400th anniversary year of Shakespeare's death. This production links so many of the things I've talked about and demonstrates in microcosm much of what I believe cultural leadership should enable. This dream included professional and amateur excellence, linked in an innovative approach developed with Equity, the Actors' Union. It included education work, national touring, the use of new technologies to rehearse remotely before the pandemic taught us all how to do that, and creative placemaking. 18 professional actors were joined by 84 performers from 14 amateur companies and by 582 children from 28 schools. The RSC worked with 13 partner theatres performing the play in all 12 regions and nations of the UK. At the same time, every school in the UK could participate in the RSC Dream Team, utilising a range of specially created resources, including new 30 and 60-minute edits of the plays. Come midsummer and the end of the national tour in Stratford, the RSC worked with Slung Low and other partners to create a fairy portal camp, a place where audiences could take part in free activities including willow work, poetry classes, improvisation, singing, dance classes, and, of course, silent disco fairy raves. And finally, in a moment of shared imagination, an attempt to open the portal between ours and the fairy world, a theatrical, immersive ceremony of feast, fire, and song. And behind all this was a leadership team confidently letting those amazing creative imaginations run free, making sure participants and audiences had the best experiences, and supporting the necessary infrastructure. My personal values centre on purpose, enjoyment, pragmatism, and above all, integrity. Whenever I've spoken about my leadership before, I've always highlighted the need for patience, the fact that I will get things wrong. Things might get messy, and it's important to balance an ability to change with an essential consistency. I'm a great believer in being calm, however urgent the situation, and in instilling calmness, in connecting with people, with engendering confidence, and to really care. On leaving the RSC, I was genuinely surprised at the feedback from former colleagues about the positive impact that this approach had for them and how they appreciated the environment that it helped to create. An environment based on the 3 planks I talked about right at the start: art, audiences, and organisation. And from my perspective, and something I realise I haven't quite said yet, these are the realities that make cultural leadership so important and so rewarding. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much indeed. And you started this by saying how surprised you were to be asked to be an Honorary Fellow at St John's. I think you've just shown us exactly why we are so incredibly lucky that you agreed to our invitation. St John's is in a really sort of interesting phase as we work really closely with the Developing Sportsman Centre and Humanities, and John Full James is here. And also we've got a long-standing relationship, as you well know, with the Oxford Playhouse. So for us, arts and culture here are incredibly important. So we'll hopefully in the next few minutes free ourselves from time and space and open up the floor to a few questions before we perhaps go and have a glass of wine or two. So if you have a question, we've got roving mics on either side. If you put your hand up, if you can give us your name, and if you have an affiliation that you want to so we can figure out who you are in the world, please do, but don't feel in any way pressurized to do so. Are there any questions in the room? Down at the front here. Thank you.
Hello, hi, thank you so much. My name's Claire Booth. I'm not from John's, but I was at Trinity, but I'm here with my friend Jenny, who is an alumni of John's. I wondered whether you might reflect briefly on the NT Live aspect of theatre provision to the public. My sister-in-law, Kate Vara, who is at the National Theatre now, was at the Old Vic during the pandemic. And I remember her saying to me how it was all very well for the NT to offer all this stuff for free, but when the Old Vic was trying to get people to pay to stream to watch this stuff, the public would often say, well, look, I can get it free from the NT. You know, why should we support you? And of course, I suppose what she was driving at was that the NT Live scenario, one of the minor cons in the major pro of it, is that perhaps it doesn't help to educate the public on what culture costs, because there's a sense by which we deserve to have it for free and perhaps it doesn't cost. And I just wondered whether you might reflect how we, you know, with the funding cuts, I'm an opera singer, so I'm invested in what's going on at ENO at the moment and all that sort of thing, how we can help encourage the public to understand the cost paradigm.
Because there's so much in there. Not least is, of course, I must also plug RSC's Live from Stratford upon Avon,
Right.
which we launched back in 2012. I think as ever, and I worry that I always sort of find a balance and a way through the middle rather than landing exactly where you're asking. But there is a balance in here, and it's not actually always the case that NT Live has been free. If you want to go and see an NT Live production in a cinema, you go and pay for it in a cinema. But it's true, and Kate's right, Kate's a brilliant cultural leader, that during the pandemic, there was a lot of free material, you know, made available to people in their own home. I don't know, and I might be wrong, that is the case now. I think you have to subscribe to get it now. So I think there probably was a case at that moment in that time to open up access to the arts. We were all, you know, stuck in our homes. Let's bring the National Theatre, let's bring the RSC into our homes. But I agree, because the people who were streaming, and it's not without its costs. I mean, it's really expensive. It's not just put a camera in and it costs, you know, it's a marginal added extra. It's a materially significant added extra to stream theatre, which is why, you know, you end up with these paid for models for it. But why it was hard for other organisations who didn't have the archive to open up to create something from scratch, an incredibly difficult time. The Old Vic, as I mentioned earlier, not having any sustainable funding, doing that from their reserves and entirely donations. But I think at that time, it was probably okay that there was a lot going on. And I think in your question is does it sometimes make people think that art should be free? And of course, sometimes it should be, but sometimes it can't be. And it's how do we get that message across as well, I think. Does that pick up enough of it? I'm very happy to be
Yes, I'd have loved your
back.
answer, but I mean, in the sense of how do we? But I think, as you say, it's a sort of million-dollar question anyway. But yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, but really interesting that a crisis led to very different ways of responding. Really interesting.
Catherine, I'm Peter Kessler. I'm unaffiliated. I really enjoyed your talk. Going right back to the beginning of it, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how we can make the arts and humanities in our educational institutions appealing and thriving and full of people who want to learn about them again, especially in a country where, you know, we seem to be under a leadership that sees these areas as very much second best and second rate.
I mean, I think a lot of it is back to as young as we possibly can. We have to, as we try to do at the RSC, and the RSC isn't alone in doing this. Lots of theatres doing this work in their communities, and the people in this room would be able to speak far more eloquently about that than me. But I think we have to, you know, get children and young people studying the arts and humanities. We have to help, as that work with the Russell Group was, to help teachers be confident that the value of those skills is indeed a value. There's some really interesting research that have been done by the UN and others about the future skills we will need in the future world. And they are often, not exclusively, I'm always hesitant in saying this, because of course studying sciences brings so much as well, but also the ways of how you have to think studying the humanities can often completely overlay in what these new skills are going to need. I mean, I see John sitting there. I mean, AI is not going to do what it should do in the best way unless the best ethical thinkers and the best people who are used to thinking and not having an answer are working in that territory. But I think you're right. It's very easy to present the flip, which is, you know, learn a practical skill, do your maths, make sure you can contribute as an engineer. But just think about engineering. You know, an Apple product would not be as beautiful if it wasn't for the art in it. We have to somehow get, I think, a bigger picture and a bigger understanding about what needs to go in to STEM. We used to have, though it's a bit out of date now, but STEM about studying science subjects. A lot of push to call it STEAM with A in it. And it is true, the STEAM, the power, I honestly think can come from the art subjects. But how, that's back to that point about advocacy. I think we have to keep being advocates. We have to get more and more good examples of why it matters. We need to really push where the fact that we need, you know, we individuals need to be rounded, but the country needs to be rounded, doesn't it, to get the best results? And how do we make sure that all the way through the education system and the policy takers who are defining that education system can think in that way? So if you've got the magic wand or the magic bullet, you know, let's know it and try and share it. But it's a hard one, isn't it? Because it's one where the argument's easier to make in one direction than the other, but we mustn't be put off by that. That the children we spoke about earlier, saying that the art subjects for them, and as I say, it's not going to be 100% the case, but for them is the only place where their ideas were valued. It's not being right or wrong. It's having the ideas valued, for thinking about those ideas, to be able to assess the value of those ideas, not in a binary way, in a way that we need us all to be able to think, to create the best world for ourselves.
I'm going to steal that idea at some point about ideas and how amazing that is. Gentleman here, please.
Thank you. My name is Patrick. I'm a graduate of the college and I have some background in theatre. Your speech was fantastic. You are so thorough and specific and insightful. I want to talk about the disruptive edge. I've just taken a play to the Vatican. The subject was child abuse. That was quite a disruptive edge. But what I want to ask you is about Birmingham, because what a change for you going from the RSC to Birmingham. And I'm very interested in this allying of the artistic work with the civic priorities. And if we were the Birmingham City Council, engaged in budgetary cuts, I'm just interested, what would the headlines be that you would say to us? I'm not putting you on the spot, but how do you persuade Birmingham that the arts are fundamental to its development?
Well, I think the short, slightly depressing answer, I suspect, is at the moment we probably don't. Birmingham's in this incredibly difficult situation with these legal financial orders surrounding it. That means there is not the money to redistribute in the way that the council would like to. So I think perhaps the starting point is what I was talking about. We've got to articulate and keep articulating to the council that when the time is right, and I think your next question would be, but let's not have it out there, it needs to be back here somewhere. But we are here, the arts are here, the arts and cultural is here. It will be better, it will be able to deliver more for you, more for your city, once you can get that funding back into it. In the meantime, let's see, are there other ways that you can help the arts and we can help you? So, for example, very practical things we're talking about, are there things in the way planning is managed, for example, that could perhaps free things up for arts and cultural organisations to do more? Are there ways in which some of the other policy requirements of the council, most obviously around health, but not just health quality of life, are there ways that there is funding there that would be put into there that could be channeled through arts and culture in some way? But I think what I was trying to say was I think that it's so difficult now that the most important thing is to develop the relationship and the dialogue so that as time passes and as things change, it doesn't fall off the agenda, because it's easy. Well, it's not easy to take out a budget line, but once it's out, it's even harder to put it back in. And I think part of the battle, for want of another word, but is to turn that into a dialogue that will make it, well, as obvious and evident as possible that when the decisions can be taken in a different way, they are taken in a different way.
One last question. Down the front here.
Thank you. Marianne Jakes, I'm Executive Director at the Playhouse. I just wanted to say thank you very much for such an inspiring talk. I'm 6 months into my new leadership role there, so for me personally it was incredibly inspiring. I wondered whether, with all of your experience of working in leadership roles in the cultural sector, and the challenges that you talked about in terms of obviously like the pandemic and cost of living crisis and the pressures that organisations are under, whether you've ever, whether you think that the set of circumstances has ever been as tough as it is at the moment, or whether you just think this is a kind of natural sort of cycle of things. And would you also have cause for optimism in the direction that we're going?
Definitely optimism. Important to cling on to optimism, but at the same time, it's always difficult, isn't it, to say whether it is harder than it was. I mean, it's, you know, these jobs have always been hard, I think. But for me, there are more strands, there are more balls to juggle, there are more things to consider than there have ever been. And I think at the moment that the environment is indeed really tough. I think where you say, is it cyclical? I think it probably is. And I think, you know, at some point, hopefully, we'll get a little bit of an upturn, hence the optimism. But I think that's why I spoke about the regenerative working piece. It is really, really hard at the moment. You sort of, sometimes it can feel as though you're going not just from issue to issue, but from crisis to crisis. You know, there's a feeling of lurching reactivity that has been hard to get out of from the pandemic, which was 2 years of that, to be honest. You know, we're all trying to pretend to be proactive and everything else, but actually it was a deeply reactive time. But I think if you look at the art on stages, look at the way people are creating theatre, look at the way audiences are still enjoying whatever cultural experience there is, you know, there has to be optimism in that. But that's not to say it's ever going to be easy, but then I'm not sure it ever has been easy. You just have to enjoy that moment, don't you, where the audience and the art come together and that bit of magic is created.
Thank you, Catherine. Is there any other questions? Then can I ask you to hold them for a moment and perhaps grab a hold of Catherine when we go and have some refreshments, which I'd like to invite you all to, just across the quad there to the other room. I hope you'll agree with me that what we've just witnessed is a masterclass in something so incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. And it has been such an honour and such a pleasure to have you on our stage. Would you please thank Catherine again one more time?
Thank you.